Hello everyone, welcome back to the another session in Principles of Programming Languages. Today we'll be going to talk about programming language implementation. This topic you will find in first unit as topic number 6. Now let's get started. What is programming language implementation? Now basically we'll write programs. What do you mean by a program? Program is collection of instructions, and where this instructions we write to fulfill some task or to execute some task, and all these instructions will follow some language. Based upon this language we'll write some instructions to execute some task, and all these will get implemented using two major components, which are memory and processor. Now, what do you mean by the memory? Memory is a storage device, or else internal memory is used to store programs and data. And this processor is what? It's a collection of circuits that provides a set of primitive operations or machine instructions. These machine instructions are also called as macro instructions. Okay, so I told you about here instructions, right? Now what are these instructions? Macro instructions. Now we'll follow some language syntax or the structure to write these kind of instructions. Now the machine language of the computer is it's a set of instructions. A language implementation system cannot be the only software on a computer. Also requires is a large collection of programs which is called as operating system, which supplies higher level primitives than those of the machine language. Now, the operating system and the language implementations are layered over the machine language interface. Now, if you see this one, and this is what your bare machine. Now this bare machine is covered with the layered structure and this is what micro instructions, and this is your operating system. Now out of this operating system there will be some implementation methods what has to be taken from the user. Let's suppose that I am writing some micro instruction over here following some language structure. Now I have to use some implementation method to get process these instructions, and these implementation methods are compilation and interpretation. Whatever micro instructions we are writing, that will be compiled or interpreted, or that will be implemented by language implementation methods. So those are basically compilation and interpretation. We'll go back to the slide now. So what are implementation methods we have? Programming languages can be implemented, or else the macro instructions what you are writing using a language can be implemented by any of the following methods, which are compilation, interpretation. What do you mean by interpretation? Compilation is what we'll see one by one. What do you mean by compilation? Compiler is a program which will convert user programs into machine code. Interpretation is what? Interpreter is also will perform the same action, that it also convert whatever instructions I am writing using the language, that is called as source language. Now the source language has to get converted into machine language. So that job will be done by compiler or compilation process, and that job will be done by interpretation. There are languages which uses compiler, there are languages which uses interpreter. Now let's see which languages will use compiler, which will use interpreter. So in compilation also there are languages which uses virtual machine. That means virtual compiler and compiler. So we know already C is a language which it is compiler. C is a language which uses compiler. Is there any other language which uses compiler? Yes. Ada is a programming language which uses compiler. Now, coming to the virtual machine, it is also a virtual compiler and which is used in many languages. Let's suppose Java uses virtual machine, that's of JVM we used to say. Java virtual machine and VB.NET compiler. It also uses virtual VB.NET computer, virtual C# compiler, C# compiler. So there are languages which uses compiler and virtual compiler or virtual machine. And interpretation is also chosen by most of the programming languages to implement the program instructions what are written by the user. And those interpretation languages or the languages which uses interpretation as implementation method, and those languages are Lisp, list-in process, the language name, and schema. Schema is also a language, and this language also uses interpreter. And most familiar language is what? Python. Python also uses interpretation implementation method to execute these instructions which are written using of that language. So this is about implementation methods, general idea. Now let's see about how the process of compilation and interpretation being handled in the computer. Now let's come to this. So when I show this diagram, you may be recollecting your ALC subject, right? Now ALC or flat or CD or some related to compiler things. So here I am introducing the phases of compiler, because compiler is a program which will convert the source language into machine language, and that's what it is written. Source language is nothing but high level language. Now let's suppose I am using a C language to write my code that has to be get converted into machine understandable language. Now look at this. My programming whatsoever I am writing using the chosen language, that has to be cross all these phases to go to machine language. And these phases are lexical analyzer, syntax analyzer, semantic analyzer, intermediate code generator, code optimizer, target code generation, symbol table, error handling. So maybe PPL will not teach you or tell you about the working principle of each phase, because it will get covered in ALC subject. But I'll give a clear glance to understand the compilation process, how it will be done. So as far as lexical analysis is concerned, the lexical analyzer gathers the characters of the source program into lexical units. The lexical units of a program are identifiers, special words, operators, and any punctuation symbols. We'll take some example to understand in better way. Count is equal to count plus 2. This is what my instruction, what I wanted to execute or implement. So I'll use some common structure which is preferred by the programming language. Let us suppose that I wanted to write this instruction using C programming structure. Now what compilation will do is, compilation will first of all gather the characters which are available in the source program into lexical units. What is a lexical unit? As I said here, identifiers, special words, operators, and any punctuation symbols. Now count is treated as one lexeme, and equal to is treated as assignment operator, and which is token. Plus is a token, 2 is a lexeme. In that way, it will separate all the instruction into lexemes or lexical units. So once after you cross this phase, you will be having several lexical units or tokens with you or with the compiler. Now, syntax analyzer takes all the lexical units from the lexical analyzer and uses them to construct hierarchical structure called parse tree. Okay, these parse trees represent the syntactic structure of the program. So I'm not going to cover about all these things, because I'm very sure you will be going to know much about all these phases in ALC. First unit of PPL will cover these two. how parse trees will get generated, how syntax will be written, right? Now, I'm moving into interpretation. What do you mean by interpretation? Interpretation is as similar as compiler as I discussed now. So the way how compiler will do execution and finding out the errors if it is there in the program, interpretation is also the same. But we have many differences to differentiate compiler and interpreter. Compiler will do it entire program. Interpretation will be done for line by line. That if I have 10 lines of code or 10 macro instructions were there in a program, all instructions will get converted at a time using compilation process. But whereas in interpretation, we'll go through with the line by line. Okay, now coming to the pure interpretation. So pure interpretation is what? Pure interpretation lies at the opposite end from compilation of implementation methods. With this approach, programs are interpreted by another program called an interpreter, with no translation of whatever. The interpreter program acts as a software simulation of a machine whose fetch execution cycle deals with software simulation, and which obviously provides a virtual machine for the language. Now you can understand with the diagram, I believe. Now I'll draw a diagram how it will do the implementation process. Let's assume that you wrote some source program. Okay, some source program you written. Now you don't have any other else to have some phases and all. We will be having an interpreter and we'll give some input data to get implemented our code, and we'll get some result. So it is what pure interpretation. In the interpretation method, an interpreter reads the source code and executes it line by line or statement by statement without first translating into machine code. So this is about pure interpretation. And the programming languages will the programming languages which will take pure interpretation as a implementation method is APL, Snowball and Lisp. These are what the programming languages which will take pure interpretation as implementation method. Now we'll see about the next category, which is hybrid implementation system. Some language implementation systems are a compromise between compilers and pure interpretations. They translate high-level language program into an intermediate language. High-level program into an intermediate language designed to allow easy interpretation. This method is faster than pure interpretation because the source language statements are decoded only once. Such implementations are called as hybrid interpretation system. Now I can draw this diagram to understand more clear. If you have some source program, now it is an hybrid system, I told, right? That means combination of compilation and interpretation. So we will be having lexical analyzer, and we'll be having even syntax analyzer, and also intermediary code generator. Then you will be having interpretation process. So half of the phases of compilation, the rest is interpretation. This is what hybrid implementation system. And just-in-time interpretation system is what? This compilation is a specific technique used in some hybrid systems. Instead of interpreting the intermediate code line by line, the virtual machine can compile the intermediate code into machine code at runtime and catch it for subsequent use. The programming languages which take this just in time is Perl as a programming language which take, and .NET is a programming language which take just in time compilation or interpretation system implementation methods. So compilation, interpretation, hybrid, just in time. Key features are source code translated into machine code. The languages are what I wrote here: C, C++, Rust, Go. Interpretation is executes source code directly. The languages are Python, JavaScript, PHP. Hybrid is combination of compilation and interpretation. So compilation phases will be till intermediate code generator. The languages are Java, C#, Python. Just-in-time compilation is compilation at runtime, which is Java, C# and JavaScript. Thank you all.